Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for having me, and I'm excited to be here and to kind of do a very more 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 unconventional talk than I usually give, but I think it's important to just kind of talk to you guys about my trajectory because it's been a little bit unusual, and maybe some of you will resonate with this because everyone here is kind of tangentially at least related to network science, which takes you through a lot of different spaces. Um, so yeah, so I want this to be kind of interactive. So feel free if you have any questions or things like that, just to like ask kind of midway. But I'll talk to you guys about what my career has been like, and then we can have a kind of longer discussion at the end. So let me just go through. Oh, here we go. So here's my roughly my trajectory, which has been kind of meandering through, a couple of different places, a couple of different departments, CS and math and physics and things like that. But I got my undergraduate degree in India in a place called Bitspilani, and it was actually a a joint program. So I had like a bachelor's and a master's, and then I had like a thesis for which I was at TU Berlin. So it was just like this kind of umbrella big program. And then I got my PhD at the University of Maryland, where I worked with Michelle Gervin. Maybe you're familiar with her. And then COVID hit, but during COVID, I had just started as a postdoc in London at this place called the Gatsby Unit, which is a computational neuroscience place where I was kind of thinking about, networks and machine learning in the context of neuroscience. And that was kind of a tricky time because I actually started my postdoc, but then COVID hit and I wasn't able to go in person. So a lot of that was just me remote trying to find a new rhythm and working with new people and things like that. But then I was wrap that up, and then I was a UC, what's called a UC presidential postdoc, and I did that in the UC University of California system, where I kind of was like in between UCLA and UC Berkeley. And then kind of through some of those relationships, and through the UC presidential postdoc, I ended up coming into contact with people at UC Santa Barbara, which is where I work now. And I ended up getting a faculty job a little over a year ago. So I've only just been doing this as faculty for a short amount of time. And it's interesting, a lot of the dynamics have changed quite a bit. And just thinking about what my expectations were as a student, because I remember it very vividly. It happened very recently, but it just gave me a little bit more perspective on kind of how how to navigate things as a student, which I'm happy to kind of chat later about. Okay, so what do I do? I really sit in a very interdisciplinary space, and I like to say I sit kind of in the middle of all of these different types of situations. Well, they're not really it's different types of fields, um, and and some of what I do is more mathematical. In every one of these domains, right? It could be mathematical analysis of graphs, more trying to understand some deep foundational questions through some mathematical analyses. Some of it could be more algorithmic, so coming up with new methods that are, how do we use a network in an efficient way to do something. And then some of it could just be very much just motivated by the application. So working with a clinician, they're interested in X, and we have this great tool where, a graph or network is an appropriate way to model X. And so the methods used then are just very much directed to what are the questions of use to the clinician and how we can best answer them. So these kind of, I think having these three kind of cornerstones of my research being very different has been very helpful because it helped me learn languages that I could use to interact with people, not just in mathematics and in maybe a more STEM discipline, but also in engineering, also in computer science, also in talking to, people that do social science or psychology or things like that. And that's been really, I would say that's been a really strong differentiator of my research that's helped me in getting, some doors open for in my career. Okay, so how did I get started? I got started. I was at TU Berlin, and this was as a kind of joint master student. And I was studying, and at the time I knew very little about networks, but I had the general, I'd taken like a token like graph theory class. But we were I was in Berlin, and I just kind of got assigned this project. Because I was like, oh yeah, I kind of, yeah, networks seem cool. I got assigned this project to think about how, um, if you have a kind of a hierarchical network or a fractal network, so maybe something that looks like this, where if you zoom in, it has the same shape, and you zoom out, it has the same shape. Um, and if you put, a coupled oscillator on it, so some differential equation, and they're all coupled, do they synchronize, right? And what is the dynamics then? And so that was kind of an interesting question, because synchronization is a very um, it's kind of a trivial dynamics, and yes, they do synchronize under some conditions, but actually they do a lot of other cool things, like maybe this guy over here and this guy over here synchronize with each other, but they're kind of doing opposite things to this guy over here and this guy over here. So and you'd see that at every scale. And so that was kind of super interesting. It was a cool thing to see, um, and cool result. So my first kind of networks experience led to a pretty successful paper as a master's student, which was great, because then I could, you know, I really liked what I did, and it helped me get into a PhD program. And then I went on to my PhD program, where I did a lot more of networks. So I started getting into this world of network science, and started going to the conferences of network science and so on. And I think for this audience, I don't have to convince you that networks are everywhere, because they kind of are, and they don't necessarily have to even be like physical networks. So the kinds of relationships that you see in and where an edge represents a physical relationship, but they could be um, causation networks. A causes B, so I put an edge between them. Correlation networks, A is correlated with B, so I put an edge between them, and so on. So they show up in a lot of different places, and in a lot of cases, not all, but in a lot of cases, they are the appropriate way to think about analyzing a complex system, if there's a lot of kind of interacting components there. So then let's kind of make our way into my PhD a little bit. In my PhD, I actually started working on networks in a more applied context, but also started working on a couple of other domains, which I'll talk about in a second. But in my PhD, I started thinking about networks. One of my kind of big projects was thinking about networks to model diseases. And this is very natural, because if you think of like a complex disease, you often this type of, let's say for example, Parkinson's, often this disease doesn't just show up one day, right? You have all these very complicated variables that are interacting in very complicated ways, including maybe you're predisposed genetically to certain things, and maybe certain symptoms are interacting with other symptoms and causing some time delayed um, responses that is then causing something else, and so on. So you could have a very complicated pattern of interaction that often can get ignored by clinicians who don't necessarily um, have all that data or the capacity or the bandwidth to know, every single decision you've made in your life, or know that you used to smoke 5 years ago or something like that. So we did this project with my advisor Michelle, and with a couple of people who were clinicians who studied Parkinson's patients. And that was kind of really exciting, because we ended up finding out some really interesting, our network analysis had some very interesting predictive power. and we were able to predict things very early in terms of how the disease was going to evolve for people, depending on their specific scenario and their specific variables. And then the other thing I started doing in my PhD, which was different from network science, was thinking about machine learning. So we had a lot of interest in my group at the time in this type of machine learning called reservoir computing, which is basically something that looks like this. Oh, can you see this? Yeah. Where you have some input that comes in and it gets processed by this reservoir layer, which is just like this fixed layer, and then you have some output weights here that you train, and then you try to predict what is happening. So for example, if I give it the image of a cat, I wanted to predict at the output, hey, this is a cat. But more interestingly, this reservoir can be thought of as a kind of a dynamical system. And so we thought it would be interesting to study this in the context of studying a chaotic dynamical system. So if this looks familiar to you, this is the kind of the butterfly effect. This is the Lorentz attractor, which is it's just a it's a it's a differential equation that you solve, and then it gives you this like nice trajectory, but it's chaotic because it switches from one wing to the other wing kind of chaotically. And the reason this is called a butterfly effect is there's a movie on this, is because when you think about a chaotic system, think of a butterfly that's like flapping its wings in, I don't know, Brazil, and this causes a hurricane in like China, because there's these compounding effects that it's such a like every tiny deviation could compound in like a million ways to cause these exaggerated scenarios. So the so this is the hallmark kind of a chaotic system, and we studied the Lorentz system, and our goal was, hey, I know it's chaotic. Tiny perturbations can really change what happens, but would the reservoir be able to predict what despite being chaotic, is it able to predict the trajectory? And so we worked on this for a while, and it was not just me, it was a huge group, and the answer was yes, it does predict it. And you can explain to some degree why it does do that, and that was pretty exciting. And that was also kind of a nice tangent into like this world of machine learning, which is very, very popular these days. But it was kind of an interesting perspective on that was very kind of untraditional machine learning, and hence powerful. It wasn't just doing the same kind of model that a million other people were doing. So that was exciting. So for my postdoc, I then went on to sorry, for my PhD, I then went on to do I took on this research position, which I talked about before, which was during COVID. And it was a it was a difficult time for all of us, but especially starting a new position at that time was kind of not ideal. But I think I made the most of it, and I think a lot of what I did then was just reaching out to people and saying, hey, I'm looking to do projects, and I have time on my hands, and do you want to chat, and do you want to work together? And I think just opening myself up to that um was really great, because at first I was like, oh, people are going to think I'm, they don't know me. Why would they want to talk to me? But then I just sent out a bunch of emails and feelers, and some great collaborations came out of it. One of them was this work with Ginestra Bianconi, who we wrote a couple of papers after this, but the focus started being from graphs to these higher order graphs, or these simplicial complexes. So simplicial complexes look kind of like this. And then the kind of nice thing about them is that in a graph, you can only represent pairwise interactions, right? So you only have edges in a traditional network. But what if you have maybe three people that publish a paper all together, all at once? Having kind of three edges can be a little bit misleading, because then the question you ask is, well, this could also mean two of them published a paper, and then two others published a paper, and then two others published a paper. So if you really want to capture these simultaneous interactions, maybe you need something that can capture three-way interactions and four-way interactions and so on. And so you can do that with a simplicial complex and equivalently with a hypergraph, but a simplicial complex, um, which is a kind of a special case of a hypergraph, has this additional, um, some additional mathematical constraints, which make it very amenable to be studied under through a lens of this mathematical theory that's well established and well known. So there's a lot of nice theory that one can use to like think of the spectral analysis of simplicial complexes and things like that. And so this also gives it a natural topology. So when we talk about topological networks or a network that has that captures topology, we're referring to these types of networks. And so this was a nice kind of journey into this topological network space. And then, of course, from there, and now this is a little bit of mix of different projects with different people. From there, you can also think of, well, I have topological networks. Can I do some topological data analysis? And this is maybe more exciting in the context of data science where you have large amounts of data. But the goal is to, I'm not going to go through exactly what this is here. If you know what topological data analysis is, then you probably already know. But the goal is to say, hey, say I have a network that looks like, any one of these panels over here. I want to understand and characterize the holes that form in the network, because these holes could be very meaningful. So for example, if this is a social network, my hole could indicate an echo chamber. And if I have a really large social network, then, and a really large hole, um, that's telling me there's like a gap here. Maybe if this is an infrastructure network, it's telling me there's a huge gap in the middle that there's no infrastructure in. If this is a brain network, these types of holes are associated with certain types of neurological disorders. Um, so there's, this is a physical network. This is like a chemical network. Then this is like the structure of the atom or the chemical compound that's telling you something useful. So you're trying to come up with a way to capture the topology of these networks and to understand where the holes are and how big they are. And so that's the general idea of topological data science. Um, and you're trying to basically come up with a summary statistic that captures the topological signature of a network. Um, and so that's kind of a hot space, an interesting space. What I do now a little bit more is topological machine learning. So integrating these ideas of, you know, machine learning with topological networks and these types of ideas, which is a very hot space and very new space. So it's prime for like if anyone is interested in doing research in it. The kind of other direction I started going into, which I also do a lot of now, was I did a lot of stuff on traditional network analysis, and then I did a lot of stuff on machine learning. And then I thought, well, okay, let me just combine the two. So I did a lot of stuff on graph neural networks and specifically explainability of graph neural networks. And there's just a huge corpus of work out there on GNNs, but there's much less that talks about how to understand, how to bridge some of the ideas of, hey, we know so much from a more traditional network analysis that we just ignore in a GNN, right? We take a machine learning model, we excuse me, we give it a graph as an input, and we just say, hey, predict what this node is going to do next, or predict where this edge is going to come up next. And so there's so much we can do to make these algorithms better, more efficient, more interpretable, that stems from our traditional network analysis. So that's kind of my focus. And then as I was doing all this, through my postdoc PhD, I was also I talked about this third direction where I said, oh, we do have these algorithms, and we do some mathematical rigorous stuff, and we do some methods stuff, and we also do some application stuff. And so there's kind of a bunch of applications that I started working on. And some of these were, successful, very successful, and some of them not so successful. But these are all like really cool things that you can do with the network analysis, or things that I did anyway. Um, One of my kind of projects that I did with actually was I was mentoring undergrads. So this was led by undergraduate students, was thinking about how um, hate speech travels in social media. So that's this first one over here. And I'm not going to go into what each figure means, because this is it's just a token figure from each project. But I'll talk about this a little bit because I think it's super exciting. Thinking about how different communities respond differently through Twitter data to hate speech, or selective speech against certain communities. And so kind of studying that was very impactful, easy enough to study, right? As I said, this was led by undergrads, but very impactful because we found very distinct ways in which people respond to racism against the Black community versus the Asian community. They look very different. The way people engage with the Black community and the Asian community online and also in real life, how these spikes in kind of hate speech online translate then to people, their behaviors in the real world. Just it's really stark. It's really interesting to look at, and these types of analyses are useful for understanding how we can mitigate these types of situations. um there's also, I did some other fun stuff, like I modeled um people doing extreme, like, mountaineering. So there's this rich mountaineering data set, and I wanted to see if networks of individuals, like previous expeditions, was like making a difference or not in their mountaineering journey. Because mountaineering, if you've climbed mountains ever in your life, or have heard of it or watched any documentary, it's a group skill. You never go up alone, but you're always alone, right? You're like, you could die and someone will just leave you to die. So thinking about how like social relationships manifest in these very high stress, kind of, should I save you, and if I save you maybe I would die, type situations. There's a lot of social relationships that exist in the mountaineering community, and so that was kind of a fun personal project. And then I did some other projects on opinion dynamics. So when people are interacting, how do they change their opinions, and things like that, and some more graph neural network related projects. I also did some stuff applied to medicine. So like I told you guys, um, we applied this to Parkinson's, and I just wanted to show you what these results looked like a little bit. So we have all of these are different subtypes of Parkinson's that are network analysis identified. And we had this huge network of lots of different variables, and each variable is, just think of it as just something that is a symptom that tells you different types of symptoms. Like, some of these are telling you about your sleep quality, some of these are telling you about physical motor symptoms, and so on. And each of these looks super different. So through no complicated you know highbrow machine learning, just by simple network analysis, we were able to find these different communities, and then and then identify for an individual that kind of just came in. So if you were a patient that came in and said, I have, Parkinson's early stage, based on your history and your life and your symptoms, I might be able to say something like, hey, with pretty high accuracy, roughly 80%, I think you fall under subtype number 3, and what you're gonna have in 5 years is this type of, cognitive disability. So maybe we can mitigate that by like preemptively training you for it, or giving you medication for it. Um, since then, and kind of currently, I do lots of um, AI for science type stuff, and this involves a lot of networks, but and also a lot of AI. And so the idea is, as I was talking through my previous slides, um, there's a lot of AI that's like a big black box that's just thrown at some data. And some of my questions are, hey, what if I have more information from the data set that I'm using? So what if I want to incorporate some topological information from my network that I'm studying? What if I want to incorporate some kind of differential equation that tells me, say I'm trying to model like the climate or the weather. This is governed by some equation, and I don't want my machine learning model to ignore that and come up with like, completely wrong results that are not physically consistent. And importantly, what if I have some complex network structure? This could be a topological network, like a simplicial complex, or this could be just a conventional pairwise network. What are kind of ways in which I can make AI respect these very well-known pre-existing domain rules in for different types of applications to science. And so one of the directions that I work on these days is in topological AI, like I said before. And one of the applications that I started working on, during my postdoc, was these things called MOFs. Um, and you might have heard of them more recently. MOFs are basically these very complicated like materials, these structures. It's called metal organic framework. And the idea is that they look like this, right? Lots of complex atoms, and they're connected in very complicated ways. And they have, among several other properties, a, a good MOF will have the property of being able to absorb and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in its pores. And so this is great for example, for climate science. But designing these MOFs in a lab can be very tedious and take several months. So the question then becomes, can we use AI or networks analysis to design new MOFs? And we can actually. I did some of this work when I was at Berkeley with some of my advisors there, and uh, with Jennifer and Christian were my advisors there, but also with Omar, who you may have heard of. He recently won a Nobel Prize, and he's the person who discovered MOFs. So a lot of his insight came from this idea that the core important structure in the MOF is in this topology, is in this eye of this core space, this pore space. And so trying to think about wholes, trying to think from a whole perspective, which is what topological uh, data science is all about, and then also thinking of the networks that are around it, which is this simplicial complex perspective, is very insightful to do this type of analysis on MOFs. I talked about physics-informed AI, and the goal of physics-informed AI is just to say, hey, let's say I'm trying to predict climate. I'm trying to predict or I'm trying to predict some kind of fluid that's flowing, right? So maybe I have a fluid, and fluids are usually described by some kind of equation, like maybe Navier-Stokes equation or something like that. And I'm trying to understand how the fluid is flowing. Maybe I want to predict cyclones in the ocean or whatever. And so I might ask this question of, hey, can I just throw data at a neural network and get it to learn it? And the answer is sometimes yes, but sometimes the neural network will just give you like real like garbage answers that are not physically reasonable. And so in order to make it physically reasonable, I add to my loss um, the residual of my equation that I'm trying to solve. So if I'm not solving this equation, and this is just an arbitrary equation, but this is whatever equation that describes your system, then my loss is going to be very, very high, which means that the neural network will try very hard to minimize this loss. That's the whole goal of the neural network. And so this type of physics-informed machine learning is recently quite popular, maybe in the past 5 years or so. And so I do a lot of studying how physics-informed machine learning works, and understanding what exactly the neural network is doing in an interpretable way. And that's all I had prepared. And just on time, I just have a few minutes that I want to take to wrap up. Um, there, so I talked about this big trajectory through a lot of different spaces and where I am now. But really, my kind of conclusion from all this, your take home message, is just do what you want to do, right? So to go where you are excited by. You don't have to necessarily be doing something that maybe your advisor needs you to do. Um, okay, this is a double-edged sword because you do want to do that to some degree because sometimes you have deadlines and you have deliverables and your advisors have you on specific projects. But explore, just keep exploring, trying new things. I did a lot of exploring in my career and it got me where I am, and I'm very happy with where I am. And I think if I hadn't explored early on, I might still be wondering, hey, what if, should I have done that instead? And it's kind of um, I mean, it's never too late, but it's kind of a little bit late for me to just do like a big career change right now. Um, so yeah, just do whatever is exciting. Um, be prepared to win some, to lose some. And this was another thing that it took me a while to come to terms with, is not every project will pan out. And sometimes it's your fault and sometimes it's not your fault. And that's okay. Just as long as you're doing enough. And I think the more experience you get, at first you're working on exactly one project, right? And if it doesn't pan out, it's really heartbreaking. But that's why do other things, and not everything will work out. And that's just a part of the process, but you will still learn something from everything you have done. And everything counts, even if it doesn't lead to a paper. Um, and this is kind of a pitch for what I do, but I think that combining network science, which a lot of you may be very familiar with this kind of AI for science, is a super exciting space. It's very interdisciplinary. It's very kind of cool right now. Lots of people are doing lots of very interesting things in it. So if you are interested in this space, read some more, reach out to people. It's fun. And my final kind of take home message is, if you want to collaborate with someone, just ask. Whether that's a peer, whether that's a professor, whether that's a postdoc, just send them an email. Um, there are strategic ways to do this, right? If you send someone an email, if you send a professor an email saying, hey, saw your website, want to collaborate, they will probably not respond to you. But if you send them an email saying, hey, I saw this work, I'm super interested in this, I've been reading about this, I had this idea, here's my previous work, uh, is this a direction that you're interested in? Or, can we talk about tangential directions that you're interested in? And if you are, that shows that you are enthusiastic, you are self-driven, you're coming in with an idea, you're coming in with offering up your skills and offering up your time. And those are much more likely to get responses. But what's the worst that can happen is you won't get a response, and that's okay too. So just reach out and ask people if you want to work with them, and ask people for references or questions or whatever it is. But yeah, there's really no downside to it. And that's just all my take home messages. That's my entire trajectory for you guys to kind of ask questions on, or just to kind of process. But yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Sanjukta. I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording. That way people can feel comfortable asking